So we're good to go?
Yep.
Cool. So I'll probably save announcements so I don't have to keep reiterating them until later, if that's okay. And I guess we'll just do it in prayer and then start the class. Is that okay? Okay. So I guess we'll go to God in prayer if that's okay. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you for this day and the blessings that you give us and for allowing us to come here and to study another portion of your word. We just pray that everything that we study here today and the things that are said and advocated are in accordance with your will, and that we look to your scriptures for guidance and for the truth that you have laid before us. We thank you so much for Jesus and for allowing him to come down and to die on the cross to let us have a chance to go into heaven with you one day. We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So this morning for class, I guess kind of just random. I just need an excuse to get up here and talk. That's pretty much it. So I thought we'd do fasting. Study about fasting, not actually do it. I know you guys are doing like an Old Testament study or whatever, so I guess it's like a mini break from that. The main context, or one of the main parts of the context that we'll be talking about fasting comes from Isaiah chapter 58, and then we'll read verses 1 through 12. Or maybe I'll actually just break it up. I won't read the whole thing all at once. So I just kind of want to read this, and then we'll go to some other verses as well as time permits. But to kind of talk about the concept of fasting, what is fasting? Should we still be doing it today? Is it required? How do we do it right? Kind of a lot of questions actually evolved around fasting because it's not highly talked about in the New Testament, and a lot of New Testament Christians really don't practice it unless you have like a colonoscopy or something. That's about the only reason that I think in today's society we fast. It's actually really big in the Mormon communities. They do a lot of fasting.
Well, wouldn't fasting be kind of a way to practice self-control?
Yeah, I mean that's one benefit of it. It can help with a lot of things. It helps you draw nearer to God. It helps you reflect and meditate on Him and His Word and
sometimes
His teaching.
When you have someone that you're warning about that they're not doing the right thing, like you feel like you want to fast because all this stuff is getting you so stressed and upset that you don't feel like eating or...
Sure, and that's actually a really common case. It's like a lot of times when someone dear to us passes away, we just have no appetite. A lot of people seem to not eat. They almost, without proclaiming an actual fast or whatever, they're fasting in a sense. Let's look at a few examples and then let's talk through it. So Isaiah 58 verses 1 through 12. This is kind of the context of God talking to us, or God talking to, in a general sense, about His own people, the Israelites, who fast. So this is God, again, from the perspective of God speaking. He says, "Cry aloud, spare not, lift up your voice like a trumpet. Tell my people their transgression, and the house of Jacob their sins. Yet they seek me," uppercase, so that's what I'm talking about. Now we're talking like as far as God's perspective. "Yet they seek me daily, and delight to know my ways, as a nation that did righteousness, and did not forsake the ordinance of their God. They ask of me the ordinances of justice. They take delight in approaching God. Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen? Why have we afflicted our souls, and you take no notice? In fact, in the day of your fast, you find pleasure and exploit all your laborers." So, first thing to notice is that fasting is not an automatic, I don't know how to put it. A lot of people think that if you fast, and especially the Israelites at that time, like it's kind of super praying. A lot of times when people, and then even in the New Testament, they say you need to pray and fast, right? And so it's kind of like, if I want something, then I pray. If I really, really want something, well, then I put on sackcloth and ash, and I also fast, and I'm mourning, and I'm tearing my clothes, and you're putting on this almost this big show. And that's what kind of turned into in the olden days. You know, have that example, which we'll read later in Matthew chapter 6, where the guy, big lofty prayers on the street corner, and he says, I tithe and mint and come in, and I fast twice a week, and I, right, as to how righteous I am, so it became a thing of, look how righteous I am, like I fast every week, look how righteous I am, and God says that he's kind of getting sick of it, because they're fasting, but they're not really fasting for God. They're fasting more for a show, so they can get the pat on the back. Oh, wow, look how righteous you are, kind of a thing. And so fasting is not an automatic, so I fasted, therefore I get what I want. And we'll kind of get that idea as we read on. So he says, in fact, in the day of your fast, so when you guys are fasting, yet you find pleasure. Like, this isn't supposed to be it's not supposed to be for you, right? You're not supposed to be finding pleasure in your fasting. You're not supposed to be, like, hating your life, and it's not supposed to put you in a state of depression. It's just, you're not supposed to be, like, having a good time while you're doing it either. And yet, I'm not sure how, because it doesn't elaborate, but in some way, they were able to find pleasure and exploit their laborers, which is kind of an interesting thought. Apparently, as we'll read on here in a second, fasting was a time to give back. It's not about me. It's like, I'm going to fast, and then during this time of my fast, I'm going to try extra hard, or what they should have been doing. That's what God says you should have been doing, but they didn't. You should be trying extra hard to be godly. You should be trying extra hard to not oppress people. If you had slaves, let them have the day off. If you had workers, try to not work them so hard, or something like that. Like while you're fasting, kind of like almost like declaring a day of rest for yourself, and you should for other people around you, maybe people that are under you. It's just kind of an interesting thought.
Rather than trying harder, why not trying smarter?
There you go. Yeah, smarter instead of harder. That works too. So verse 4, it says, indeed you fast for strife and debate, and to strike with the fist of wickedness. You will not fast as you do this day, to make your voice heard on high. Is it a fast that I have chosen, a day for a man to afflict his soul? And so here's another interesting thought when we get to verse 5, is that fasting is not God declared. Fasting is for you and for whatever cause or thought or whatever that you have. It's not, there's no day that God says you have to fast at this day each month or whatever. This is something that you do. And so that's why he's kind of mad, because they're doing it all the time, and they're like, why haven't we gotten what we wanted because we were fasting? And it's like, well, did I tell you to do this? You're the one who's deciding to do this, and yet you're not even doing it right. And yet you're the one that's setting it forth yourself. So kind of you guys need to, get in control of this and then figure this out, kind of a thing. Midway through verse 5, is it to bow down his head like a bulrush and to spread out sackcloth and ashes? Would you call this a fast and an acceptable day to the Lord? It's like, did I make you do this? Did I make you put on when you fast? Again, there's nothing that God actually commands. God never, it's kind of funny as we read in the Old Testament, as I'm studying this, we read all the time when people get upset, grieved, mourn, whatever their cause for the fasting is, they tear their clothes, they put on sackcloth, they sometimes put ashes on their head, and God's kind of like, did I tell you to do this? He never command. This is what they did as a tradition, but God never expected that of them. Sure, fast, don't eat. That's a good idea. That's a good concept, and so that's what he means by fasting. But fasting does not automatically incorporate dump ashes on your head, put on a potato sack, and whatever else. It's completely extra biblical as far as what the Israelites are doing, and that's kind of what he calls out in verse 5. So in verse 6, he starts talking about, like I was saying, this idea of loosening the load on people if you decide to fast. He says, is this not the fast that I have chosen, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, and to let the oppressed go free, and that you break every yoke? Is it not? Is it not sarcastically? Maybe not. That's not the right word. I don't know. I'm struggling here. What is he trying to say? He's saying, is it not for this? It's not a real question. Is that sarcastic? I don't know why. My brain's not working right now. Rhetorical. Thank you. I'm like, I don't know. It's not the right word. Thank you, Mark, for having a swifter brain than I. So he's speaking rhetorically as far as asking these questions. So the answer is basically the opposite of what he's asking the question of. Like, is it not to do this? Is it not like obviously it is. That's the whole point of fasting, which is then interesting because we never associate fasting with this. So anyway, is it not? I'm rereading verse 6. Is this not the fast that I have chosen to loose the bonds of wickedness, right? To in a sense, to do good, right? To reflect on God, to not be sinning, to undo heavy burdens. It should be to let the oppressed go free, to break every yoke. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and that you bring to your house the poor who are cast out? When you see the naked, that you cover him, and not hide yourself from your own flesh? Then your light shall break forth like the morning, your healing shall spring forth speedily, and your righteousness shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. And you shall cry, and he will say, here I am. God will end up saying, here I am. Like, you're going to cry out. If you fast in the appropriate way, which he just outlined, it's the point in fasting, again, fascinating, which, believe it or not, the Mormons have right in the sense of the work. They don't have it right because they like to toot their horns when they do it. But the Mormon church actually requires fasting. At some points, they dictate specific fasts, like just for lunch or just for dinner or whatever. And then whenever those people do fast, even though I think it's a rare occasion they dictate it, but it's kind of like one of those nudge, nudge, wink, wink, like you really should be fasting more kind of thing. So it's kind of an expectation put on them. And because I have one friend who does it fairly regularly, not like every week, maybe every other week or every once a month or something. And what they do is they're supposed to, whenever they fast, they take the money that they would typically save for that meal. So that they're like, okay, well, I fasted for lunch and dinner, and typically on this day I would go to McDonald's and then I'd go to the Sizzler or something. So that would have cost me $15, $20 or whatever. So they take that exact same amount of money that they would have spent on the food that they fasted for, and then they have to give it to the church. But then of course it's the church, right? And it's like it becomes a money-making scheme. Like, you need to do this, right? And it's almost like to their credit, because you're looking at this verse and you're going, okay, wow, I didn't really realize that, right? The whole point of fasting, verse 7, is to share your bread with the hungry, and that you bring your house with the poor who are cast out, and when you see the naked. The whole point of fasting is give your meals basically to God. Fast, don't eat, and then take that time, that money, that effort that you did in fasting, and then go give that to somebody who's in need, right? You don't eat your food, and then you give that food to someone who's hungry, right? And that's one of the ways of fasting that we get the, okay, I'll fast, I just won't eat, but we never get the extension of that, and I will take whatever basically money I've gained from fasting and give it to someone else, which the Mormons do, but then they're commanded to give it to the church. So that's how they do that, Mitch.
Well, I think a good example of what he's talking about here, starting in verse 6, would be with Esther. You know, before she approached Mordecai, she fasted for 3 days and 3 nights, her and her maids. Mm-hmm. It wasn't for her that she did it, it was on behalf of the people, her people.
Yep. Was that Ezra 8?
Ezra 4.
4, okay.
Esther 4, verse 16.
Well, Esther, I had Ezra. I was like, yeah, I have that, I think. Okay, yeah, I have Ezra. And then I have Esther, I also have Esther 9, 29 through 32, though I don't have it memorized, so I'm not sure. Oh, Esther 4:16, okay, sorry, I'm looking through all my notes. Yeah, so 4:16, she did it to seek aid from the king, 3 days, fast for the people, and then a tradition was established to fast to remember the deliverance of the Jews in Esther 9. It's kind of an extenuation of that. So yeah, so there's other examples. I think that's pretty much what I wanted to hit on for this section. I said through verse 12, but actually it's more like through verse 11. But then starting in verse 9, again talking about the fasting, and then God says, basically, this is how I'm going to hear your prayers, right? If you fast in this way, on top of praying, then, I hate to say it, but I don't really know a good way of explaining it. It does become somewhat of a super prayer, I guess. You know, it's like a true dedication. It's like a I really mean this, right? I mean, how often do we pray, and it's more like well, yeah, I pray and I expect to be heard and whatever, and that's all well and good, and I'm not trying to take away from that thought or that fact, but it's just kind of like that extra step of, no, I really mean it, and I'm really serious about this, God, and I really need your help, and though you can still pray that without fasting, it's almost like fasting just puts forth that extra sacrifice to God, kind of that extra oomph or whatever, to say, I'm really serious about this. I really want your help. Like, help me out with this, whatever. I'm fasting on your behalf. I'm reflecting on you. That's that sort of a mentality. But it's not to take away from anything if you don't. It's just, I don't know. It's just, it's kind of hard. It really is. For me, it's hard to define really what it does, or why is it that this is better or worse or whatever than just simply praying, like instead of fasting and praying. But there is some sort of extra weight put on prayer and fasting versus just prayer. Go for it.
Well, when do we pray with our most sincerity, with our most earnest need, is when we're in some sort of anguish, when we're suffering of some kind. Fasting, I don't know if anybody's ever fasted for 3 days, but you go 3 days without food and water, you're going to be in anguish. You're going to be in that, state of mind, if you will.
Sure.
To where you're going to be more earnest.
Yeah.
Whereas it's easy to become distracted, in our everyday prayers, because we're not suffering any kind of anguish. We're pretty content, and when you're content, you take things for granted.
Yeah, it kind of helps put things in perspective when you're praying. Good thought. So, reading on, I think I'll just read this really quick, but I don't know if I have too much commentary left on this. Verse 9, though, it says, Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry, and he will say, Here I am. If you take away the yoke from your midst, the pointing of the finger and speaking wickedness, if you extend your soul to the hungry, and satisfy the afflicted soul, then your light shall dawn in the darkness, and your darkness shall be as the noonday. The Lord will guide you continually, and satisfy your soul in drought, and strengthen your bones. You shall be like a watered garden. So, this is just God saying, hey, I can make your days great. I can make your spiritual life and your physical life better. I can whatever. But when you decide to fast, do it in this way, and then. I will hear you, and I will answer, and I will help you with whatever your plight is. So fasting can be done in a lot of different ways, and for a lot of different reasons. Again, the Bible doesn't really specify what is or isn't. Basically, you can fast for anything that you would typically pray for. I mean, if you have any simple prayer request that is an acceptable, we won't go into the whole realm of what is and isn't acceptable prayer, but as long as it's an acceptable prayer to God, and it means that much to you, you're more than welcome to fast while doing it. A lot of the times, though, I'd say 90% of the time, fasting is actually done as more of a show of grief or despair, or something that you're sad about, or something that you're depressed about, on behalf of, like for Esther, her nation's going to be wiped out, she has good cause for not wanting to eat, or what have you. I was about to say drink, but it's never, I don't think drinking is ever implied in fasting. It's usually fasting from food. Quick anecdote. Whenever I see fasting in the Bible so far, and I will admit to saying that maybe I could be wrong, but as far as the examples that I see, fasting is always all or nothing. It's more than likely an entire day. It's usually a 24, that's the example that I'm seeing. It's a day of not eating, not like a meal. A lot of people want to advocate, well, I'll fast for lunch, or I'll fast for dinner. That's kind of another characteristic that the Mormons do a lot. They almost never do full day fast. They always say, I will fast from lunch, or I will fast from dinner. But then it's I don't really know if that's, I don't know, is that a worthy enough fast, I don't know. To me, right, I think of whole day, multiple day, like Esther, like Jesus fasting for 40 days, kind of a thing. Obviously, you can't do water, I guess, just by extrapolation, or however you want to say that. You can't fast 40 days from water, you'll die. So obviously, drinking is never included. It always seems to be some sort of a day time frame, not a meal time frame. And also, it always seems to be food specifically, because another thing is, even I think Catholics and whatever, they for Lent, right? Then you fast from an item or a thing, right? I will fast from watching my favorite TV show. I will fast from chocolate. I will fast just from soda. I will fast just from... And I've never seen an example in Old or New Testament yet that specifies a thing to be fasted from. And I've never seen an example where it hasn't been like a whole day. Like, it's at least, it seems like the minimum is like a 24-hour day. So, and I could be wrong. I mean, I really could be wrong. I just maybe haven't found the verse yet that maybe... I said, like, as I'm talking, I'm like, one, like, maybe, I guess, David, but I have to find that verse. I'm trying to think, David, when, that's not really fasting. I was thinking of when he said that, you know, you let those guys have the meats and the wines, and then David said, I'll do the vegetables and whatever, but that wasn't really a fast. I was thinking, like, oh, he fasted from meats, so I guess that's, like, a thing, right? But he still ate vegetables, but I guess it wasn't really a fast declared. It was just to prove that I could eat inferior food and still be just as healthy, if not healthier. Okay, never mind. Sorry. Me and Mike, as I'm thinking and talking at the same time. Okay, so we'll look at some of the examples of people fasting, mainly Old Testament, because it was far more practiced in Old, but that doesn't take away that it's still something that can be done in the New Testament. So Old Testament-wise, it was done for deep grief, when you're grieved, when you're sad, someone passed away, or someone might pass away, kind of a thing. David, which I won't go to that verse, but we all know the example of David when he committed adultery with Bathsheba, and then he fasted that his son would be saved. But God didn't grant it. So again, kind of twofold there, an example of fasting for the right reasons, to try to plead earnestly, to try to show God his commitment to how much he wanted this child to be saved. But then at the same time, just because he did doesn't mean he gets what he wants, right? Just because you put on the sackcloth or the don't eat or the whatever, that does not mean it's an instant. I mean, just like any normal prayer, right? Just because you pray doesn't mean you automatically get it. No, it means that it could be yes, no, or maybe kind of a thing. It just depends on whether it's aligned with God's will. If you want to look at 1 Samuel chapter 7, verses 3 through 6. 1 Samuel chapter 7, verses 3 through 6 says, Then Samuel spoke to all the house of Israel, saying, If you return to the Lord with all your hearts, then put away the foreign gods and the Ashtoreths from among you, and prepare your hearts for the Lord, and serve him only, and he will deliver you from the hand of the Philistines. So the children of Israel put away the Baals and the Ashtoreths, and served the Lord only. And Samuel said, Gather all Israel to Mizpah, and I will pray to the Lord for you. So they gathered together at Mizpah, drew water, and poured it out before the Lord. And they fasted that day, and said, There we have sinned against the Lord. And Samuel judged the children of Israel at Mizpah. So, Israelites, as is like the story of their life, ended up sinning, and ended up diverting from God entirely, and going towards serving fake gods, and Baals, and Ashtoreths. I have a little sub-note, but I don't really know what an Ashtoreth is, I'm not going to lie. Chapter 4. Let's see what that little... Images of Canaanite goddesses. Okay, so they're worshiping goddess women, as well as like the golden calves and Baal and things of that nature. And then they realize that they were wrong. Finally, at some point, they repent and they want to prove that we're not. It's not just like that flippant, okay, yeah, you caught me, I'm sorry, I'll start serving God again. Like, they were grieved, and they were saddened, and they were depressed over this, that, wow, we really screwed up here, guys. They're like, okay, well, like, we'll pray today, and again, that day, right, it's a whole day. It's breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and then the next day, you can start eating again, kind of a thing. But for that day, they decided we won't eat, we're going to fast, to prove how much we're lamenting over the fact that we turned from God, and we want to show God that we're going to start afresh, and we're going to do it right this time, so we won't eat, just to prove how serious we are about our repentance and turning back to God. The people fasted while confessing their sins to God. Nehemiah chapter 9, verses 1 through 3. The people of Nineveh that Jonah was to save, Jonah chapter 3, verses 5 through 9. After Jonah converted them and they realized the error of their way, they also declared a fast. They said, let's fast and pray about this. that because of the wickedness that they have done. Someone kind of fast forward, and I got a lot of verses, so I'm just going to kind of fast forward, just say the verses instead of reading them, and then if you want to go back at some point in time and rewatch this, I guess since we're recording, and then you can check out the verses. When people were grieved because of sin, similar to what we just read actually in 1 Samuel, Israel fought against the tribe of Benjamin because of the sin Benjamin was harboring. Yet despite God's acceptance, they still lost many men in the battle, and they ended up fasting. Judges chapter 20, verses 18 through 28. The people fasted at the morning to mourn the death of Saul when he passed. 1 Samuel 31, 2 Samuel chapter 1, 11 through 12. Then we have the examples of Esther and how she fasted on behalf of her people. Nehemiah mourned when he heard that his people were in trouble, and he fasted. Nehemiah 1, verses 1 through 4. So there's a lot of examples. There's just a lot of people fasting whenever they find out. You know, there's a lot of war in that time. I mean, there still is, realistically, I guess. But, you know, when their nation specifically had to, like, go to war, and they're sad about the potential of losing people, or the potential of someone dying, or after someone had died, or whatever. So that's a lot of occasions for fasting, if you will. I'm kind of more, I guess, personal, right? Like extra biblical. So stepping away from the Bible, I'm kind of more like, well, I guess not really, not too distant. I'm kind of more in the sense of David. I don't really get, and this is just me, maybe just throwing it out there for discussion. I don't really get fasting after someone's died. I get that some people may want to fast in the sense of, I'm so sad I don't feel like eating, right? I just lost my mom or my dad, and they're super close to me, or my brother, my sister, or my wife, or whatever, and you're so stricken by grief, food is the last thing on your mind, right? You don't really care to eat because you just don't feel like it. It's not that you need to declare a fast and you're going to fast. I guess when you're praying, you're making, I feel like a lot of the time, the whole point in fasting is to help in your intercession and your asking of God's help. And so after someone's died, it's almost like, what's the point? I almost hate to say that. I do. I'm not trying to be belligerent or whatever of people's beliefs or faith. But it's similar to like what David did, right? David's like, I want my baby to live. Like, I will do whatever it takes to show God that I'm really serious, right? As a king who has every luxury of food available, right? I won't eat. I won't whatever. Like, give me my kid. Don't take him from me. And then the baby dies, and then what does he do? He immediately gets up and he starts eating, and he's like refreshed or whatever the Bible says, kind of thing. Because it's like, okay, it's done. Like, I can't fast to make my baby go into heaven. Again, the whole discussion in and of itself, you know, I mean, obviously the child is innocent, and most likely, I can't only assume he goes to heaven. There's technically no verse either. Sorry, a lot of sub-topics coming up. But, I mean, you can't fast someone into heaven. So let's say even if it was an older adult, and it's like, oh, my grandma or grandpa or whatever meant a lot to me, but they were never Christians, and they never even cared to go to church, and they never even loved God in any way, shape, or form. Well, I'll fast now that they're dead, and maybe God will hear my plea to get them into heaven, or now that I'll fast, I just don't get it. But again, that's me, right? I'm just kind of throwing it out there.
Well, just an idea that maybe the person who died was such an influential person or personality that maybe the person's so concerned of what the future's going to hold.
Sure.
So maybe you fast at the death of this person who might be a loved one, but for fear out of concern for the future.
Sure, and that'd be kind of more back into the realm of personally, me, Jason, would think that it's more apropos at that time. But I guess, I don't know, I kind of just don't get it. I don't, like I said, I don't know how to word it other than I feel like I'm being a jerk or something, but I just don't really get the idea of like not eating, unless you don't want to eat, feel free not to eat, but I mean an actual declaring of fasting and praying after someone's dead. I mean, I know that you're sad, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with not eating after someone died, but I just don't really get the whole. I'm more in line with David. Like, I completely get it. Like, it makes more sense to me. Like, I'm lamenting because he's going to die, and God said it's going to happen. But maybe I can change his mind. But then it's like, okay, well, he's dead. There's nothing I can do now, right? The person's soul is literally in God's hands, so there's nothing I can do. I can't change it. Whatever's going to happen now in the afterlife. So, other reasons to fast is also to demonstrate humility. I'm going to breeze through these again because a lot of verses and not a lot of time. So, even the wicked fasted at times of grief. 1 Kings chapter 21. While jump back again, fasting to request aid from God. Ezra chapter 8, verses 21 through 23. David used fasting to humble himself while praying for his enemies. So, which is kind of fascinating that he decided to not eat to show a seriousness for his praying, while yet praying for his enemies. Something that, one, we find it hard enough to do, but he was so sincere and so grieved over wanting to pray for his own enemies. Anyway, that's Psalms 35, 12 through 14. Sackcloth, though, again, is not, I'm not trying to hate on that. God, it doesn't seem ever really God never actually commanded sackcloth and ash and whatever, though people did do that at the time. And the kind of the purpose for it was kind of like fasting is sackcloth for the soul. So they wanted to, for the Jews who didn't do it out of show, they literally wanted to put themselves in the most itchy, annoying, like, humbling before God. And that's fine, but the problem is it ended up turning into a for show thing, like this big theatrical, like, nonsense. But then some people were, like, so grieved over something that they decided to not only fast, but they put on sackcloth, which is just uncomfortable, and like they put themselves in a ridiculous state of dirtiness. I mean, they dumped ashes on themselves. They put on terrible fitting, not comfortable clothes. It's like they wanted to make themselves as just low and as, I don't know, hating their own life, I guess, as possible, to like show God how serious they were about being grief-stricken or whatever, what have you. Example of that, the whole sackcloth and stuff, Psalm 69, 10 through 12. Okay. So another purpose, though, for fasting, which we've kind of already hit on, is that it's really meant for being able to completely focus on God. So fasting is also for just simply being able to focus on God and spend time in prayer to Him, and maybe using your hunger. So you'll go to be hungry, obviously, so use that as your reminder that, I need to be praying more, and I need to whatever. So if you're in a constant state of hunger, you're constantly being reminded that you need to be praying more, focusing on God more, studying more, whatever it is that you're going to kind of dedicate. Examples of this, 2 Chronicles 21 through 4, Esther again, chapter 4, verse 16, chapter 9, verse 29 through 32. Daniel wanted to focus his attention on God, so he fasted, Daniel chapter 9, verse 3. And again, it should be a time filled with righteous deeds. It's not all about us in the sense of when we fast, like a woe is me, whatever kind of thing. It is really meant for doing for other people. That's from the latter part of what we just read, Isaiah 58, verses 6 through 11. So think of it as when I fast, what can I do for other people? Maybe I can take the money that I save from fasting and give it to a charity of some sort, or maybe if you can provide a meal for someone while you fast or something. It's kind of weird in today's society. I don't know, if we fast and then go buy a lunch for a homeless person or something. I don't know. I don't really know exactly how to extrapolate that to today's society. Or you could give to the church. There's still nothing wrong with that. It's just the fact that I think they're commanded to give to the church. Whereas again, it's supposed to be between you and God. It's not supposed to be told to you by the church, or the church is not meant to make you use your funds for something specific or whatever. It's just between you and God. And so whatever you feel you want to do, as long as it's in the lines of charity and as long as it's in the lines of helping others or whatever, if you want to do something with that money, then it's more than acceptable. Fasting does not make God listen. It's not an automatic, I fasted, therefore God has to grant me what I want. And you get that concept from what our main reading, Isaiah 58, verses 2 through 4, but also in the sense of David, when fasting for his baby. He didn't get his baby just because he fasted. Let's look at Zechariah chapter 7, verses 5 through 6. Can we try to end 15 till? If so, I kind of failed. So Zechariah 7, 5 through 6 says, "Say to all the people of the land and to the priests, when you fasted and mourned in the 5th and 7th months during those 70 years," I really like this wording here. This is God speaking to his people again. Did you really fast for me? For me? Like, for me? Like, was it really for me, or was it for you? Because when you eat and when you drink, do you not eat and drink for yourselves? Should you not have obeyed the words which the Lord proclaimed through the former prophets when Jerusalem and the cities around it were inhabited and prosperous, and the south and the lowlands were inhabited? So here we have an example of the children of Israel's disobedience, and maybe now they're trying to fast, almost like trying to make up for what they didn't do. And God's ticked. He's not throwing any bones about it. He's like, I don't care that you're fasting. It's all like, you know what, you should have been doing this sooner, when you've already been given prophets which proclaim to you that you should be turning from your ways, and whatever the situation is. I don't have the exact full context of what's going on here, but yet again they've turned away. God's saying you need to turn back, but they didn't do it, and guess what? Now that they're suffering the consequences of their decision, now they want to fast and whatever, and God's like, really? Like, really? Now you're going to do it? And it's like, now that you're fasting, are you fasting for me? Like, is this really for me, or is it because that now that you're suffering and it's like a woe is you, that you're being, it's like a child being spanked, It's like could you imagine if, like, your kid, you said, don't do this, and then they specifically did it, and then you went to go spank them, and you're spanking them, and they go, I'm going to declare a fast that you won't spank me, And it's kind of like, obviously I don't know if a child has ever done that, but it would be kind of ridiculous. It'd be like really? Like, I don't care that you're not fasting for me or for a godly cause. You're fasting because you don't want to get spanked again. And it's like, that's not going to happen. I'm going to spank you as long as you're going to keep being disobedient. So that's kind of the context there that's happening with this. People should not, so another main key thing about fasting, Matthew chapter 6, verses 16 through 18. Fasting should not be for show. It's supposed to be something between you and God, and that's where it's kind of hard for me to grasp the concept of the ash and the sackcloth and everything back in the Old Testament, because then you can't help but know that a person's fasting because they look like trash and they're wearing literally a potato sack. That's sackcloth. So it's like, how do you miss that? So obviously you can't do that and not let people know that you're mourning or you're fasting. But New Testament, it says not to do that, not to do something for show. Matthew 6, 16 through 18 says, "Moreover, when you fast, do not be like the hypocrites with a sad countenance, for they disfigure their faces, that they may appear to men to be fasting. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But you, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that you do not appear to men to be fasting, but to your Father who is in the secret place, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly." So, again, this concept of fasting, Jesus addresses in the New Testament, so it's still something that's completely acceptable. But in this sense, God's kind of saying, put away this ash, this sackcloth, this whatever you guys were doing. I don't think it was ever commanded by God in the first place. And do the opposite. Instead of dropping your countenance, wailing and lamenting, putting on the filthiest clothes you have and whatever, do the opposite. Clean, wash your face, put on your makeup, look as nice as you possibly can, so that no one even has a clue that you're fasting. Because it's not supposed to be about getting attention. It's supposed to be about letting God know, between you and God alone, that I have a request, and I'm very serious about this, and I would like to show you my sincerity and my seriousness in this request by refusing to eat for one day. I will show you that I rely on you, right? Man shall not live by bread alone, kind of a thing, right? I don't rely on my food, I rely on you, God, and I want you to know that. So don't make a show of it, don't let people know that you're doing it. It's between you and God. Luke chapter 18, verses 11 through 12 is a good example of how not to do it. That's the man on the street corner, giving the big lofty prayer and whatever, and he says, I do this and I do that, and I fast twice a week and I whatever, and it's like, oh, good for you, Again, that's the whole, you have your reward. God already says that. Verse 16 in the Matthew 6, that surely I say to you that they have their reward. The people who disfigure themselves, who lament, who put on a big show, let people know about how much they fast and whatever. It loses its purpose and it loses its credibility to God if you're going to use it as a tool to get a pat on the back. So I'm fast forwarding through my notes. Fasting, so some more New Testament to get into kind of more applicable to us, because there's really not a lot other than Jesus says, don't do it for show, which is a lot of what the people did in the Old Testament. That's what we just read in Matthew 6. Don't be like that person who gloats about how much he fasts. So obviously it's supposed to be between you and God. So we got those verses. Other examples, the disciples fasted while serving God and before major events. Acts chapter 13, verses 2 and 3. We can probably read a couple of these, since there's really not a lot said in the New Testament. Acts 13. Acts 13, verses 2 and 3, it says, and they ministered to the Lord and fasted. The Holy Spirit said, now separate to me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them. Then having fasted and prayed and laid hands on them, they sent them away. So they still practice this in the New Testament, this concept of fasting and praying to make sure, not only to ask of God, kind of like for guidance in this situation. They weren't mourning anybody, but they just weren't sure what to do. They weren't sure what the will of God was for them. And they wanted to make sure that they fulfilled that. So they fasted, they prayed, and then they made their decision. And then obviously with God's help in some way and helping to make that decision. Acts chapter 14 and verse 23. So when they had appointed elders in every church and prayed with fasting, they commanded them to the Lord in whom they had believed. So appointing elders was kind of a big deal. This is like the first appointing of elders. And they, again, wanted to make sure they had the right men. And it meant a lot to them. It just shows how much it meant to them to make sure that they appointed the correct spiritual leaders to the point where they felt it necessary to not only pray, but to fast for God's help and His guidance in this to make sure that they made the right decision, because they don't want to accidentally appoint a disqualified elder or someone that, that shouldn't be holding that position. So it meant a lot to them, and so they decided to fast over the appointing of elders. Again, the interesting thing, though, is that this does not make it a command. Again, there is no, like, okay, whenever you appoint elders, the whole congregation has to fast for a day. I don't believe it's that type of an example. But again, going back to the thought that it is between you and God. If your church decides to do that, well, there is nothing wrong with that, and I'm sure God will find that more than acceptable. The last point then that we'll make comes from Matthew chapter 17, verses 19 through 21. That it's just an interesting, right, thing to know that they were trying to cast out demons, and it couldn't be done. And Jesus specifically tells them that you can't do this without prayer and fasting. Like it's not good enough just to be a good, righteous person. You need that almost that concept, which I fail to have the right words, but that extra oomph of a prayer, right? Like this demon's like too legit for you. You can't cast it out. The only way it's going is with prayer and fasting. And we'll read that really quick. 17, 19 through 21. So it says, then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, why could we not cast it out? So Jesus said to them, because of your unbelief, for assuredly I say to you, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you will say to the mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. However, this kind of demon does not go out except by prayer and fasting. So it's just interesting that it was required for them if they were serious. One, they were lacking faith, so they have that on them too. So one way of getting faith, though, they could have fasted and prayed and read their Bibles and acquired more faith and sought that from God. But also, it's just interesting that this, so however, right? He's like, well, you lack faith, so that's why you failed, honestly. But regardless, even if you had faith, this kind of demon's not going to come out unless you commit yourself to prayer and fasting. Which is kind of like, oh wow, like, I mean, that this is not the typical, you're a good Christian, cast the demon out. This is like you need to truly show your commitment to God by prayer and fasting in order to get this type of demon out. I don't know the exact details, just an interesting anecdote, I guess, just to say that. It's fascinating, I guess. Okay, so that's all I got. Sorry, basically turned into a sermon, but whatever. You have the official sermon coming up.